Well, happy Archaeology Month, everybody, and welcome to the Duxbury Free Library. And we are digging John Alden today. My name is David Murphy. I work here upstairs. I'm glad that you all could come on this beautiful day. It's wonderful Columbus Day. So we have three scholars here to talk about the early settlers and current research. Desiree Mobed is the director of the John Alden House. Elizabeth Tarulis, I'll get to her bio in one moment, and Mark Jacobson, who some of you may know. Elizabeth is an archaeologist and a graduate student at UMass Boston. Her ongoing research compares patterns of 17th century ceramics in Plymouth to other 17th century colonies by looking at ceramics, sorry, I butchered that, particularly which countries these ceramics came from. Her talk will discuss the history of archaeology conducted at Alden's First Site, her current research, and the importance of looking at collections that were excavated in the past. Okay, hang on 1 second, let me give you Mark's. Okay, Mark Jacobson is a partner and senior vice president of Newport One, a Duxbury-based fundraising agency working with nonprofit organizations nationwide. Native to the South Shore and a 10-year resident of Duxbury, Mark has had an intense, lifelong interest in local history. Mark did master's work while in college in locating the sites of Mayflower, Pilgrim homes, and burial places, including extended time in Duxbury with local historians, including Dorothy Wentworth, in pursuit of elusive answers. He has researched primary and secondary sources, traced deeds, and explored sites ever since. He's secretary of the board of directors of Duxbury 2020 and also assists Plymouth 400 with his fundraising efforts. He has spearheaded Duxbury's 2020 archaeological work in locating the site of Pilgrim Henry Sampson's home here in Duxbury, and will today share an update on the results of that work. Okay, so let me change the slide.
I know that close.
It doesn't have a clicker.
Put on my glasses so I can see the clicker. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming today. It's an absolutely spectacular October day, and don't we just deserve that? I am the director of the Alden House Historic Site, and my role here today is just to set the stage for some really fascinating updates and news and research that's going on about archaeology from the Alden First Site and also from another Pilgrim, Duxbury Pilgrim, the Henry Sampson site. So allow me to figure out if I can move this clicker, see what happens. Oh, there we go. So Alden House, the Mayflower Pilgrims, John and Priscilla Alden, came to Duxbury along with several of the other Duxbury families about 1627 on their land grants. And for the Aldens, they had about 100 acres. It was 20 acres per family member. And the Alden family has basically been in Duxbury, or has owned that ever since. It is now a National Historic Landmark, and the current Alden House is open as a museum. Several of you all, if you're local, may have seen that. We do educational programs. Adjacent to that, though, is the site that we're talking about today, and that's the Alden First Site. So in the 19th century, the family sold that out of the Aldens to the Wright family. It's now owned by the town, and it sits just behind the sports fields on the school complex. In the 1960s, the school was looking at leveling some of the playing fields sometimes I think the Aldens have lucky stars that kind of follow them, because on one of the school staff, the custodian, Russell Edwards, kept a close watch on this leveling of the playing fields project, because it had been known that the Alden First Site, which the house had long since disappeared, was somewhere in that area. And he literally later talked about, watching every day to make sure the bulldozers didn't come through. The president of the Alden Kindred at that time very generously supported an archaeological dig. And so in the 1960s, that did happen, and the artifacts that were pulled up at that time are a rich assortment of 17th century tools, household items, personal items, and so forth, some of which we're still studying today, thanks to the University of Massachusetts, Boston. We also have launched we're trying to look at new ways to look at the first site for visitors, because they're fascinated by it. They look at, the stone outline, which many of you probably been down to see, and I counted you all, there are about 10 of you. So each of you, think about this. If you represented one of the Alden children, figure out how you move around that 38 by 10 foot space. We've recently launched a new website that will track some of the updates on research. So please check it out. It's called Alden First Site. And the other thing that we are opening in next month is a archaeological exhibit of some of the items, some of which have really never been seen before, that were unearthed in the 1960s. They've had some new scholarship. It's being professionally curated by Stephen O'Neill. We're really, really excited to share this with Duxbury and all those interested in Pilgrim history. The Alden First Site, as you can see it today, thanks to this really wonderful drone photograph. Just a quick mention of Duxbury 2020, the town organization that is doing so much to try to bring together some of this fascinating 17th century Pilgrim and Native American history in honor of the 400th commemoration. So without further ado, I would like to turn this over to Elizabeth and her presentation about the ceramics.
Desiree welcomed you all, but I'd like to take a moment to welcome you again. Just as a quick reminder, I'm Elizabeth Tarulis. I am a professional archaeologist and graduate student at UMass Boston. And I know that you're all here to learn about the Alden First Site, but before we begin, I'd just like to take a few moments to discuss what exactly it is I do as a professional archaeologist. Yes, worked. So when you do a Google search for the word archaeologist, a few things come up repeatedly. This slide shows a sample of some of those photos on the Google image search. So the vast majority of these photos, about 70 of the first 75, are pictures like the one on the left here, of people out in the field digging. Of course, Indiana Jones comes up a few times, and apparently Jedi archaeologist is an actual thing in the Star Wars universe, which I am thrilled about. However, these photos don't represent how archaeologists spend the majority of their time. Archaeology is the study of the material remains left behind by humans. This can be anything from old building foundations to potsherds to charred seeds left in a cooking fire. In order to understand these material remains, we have to process and study them in the laboratory. This is a time-consuming process. Every hour a person spends in the field makes about 4 hours of work in the lab, sometimes more depending on how much we're finding. After an artifact leaves the field, it has to be carefully cleaned to remove all of the dirt. Once it's cleaned up, it becomes much easier to view the details. We then sort the artifacts and record at least a basic level of characteristics. For example, whether something is a tin glazed punch bowl or a flake from stone tool production. Once everything has been sorted and recorded, we put the artifacts into clean new bags and place them into storage to be used later by researchers or in exhibits. Finally, we make digital copies of all of our work and write up our findings in a final report. So to give you an idea of the time this takes, here is what I've been working at my job this week. Just a disclaimer, this is not from the Alden site, but I promise we're getting to that. In this photo, I'm sorting the piles of pipe stems on the left-hand side. I don't know whether you can see the colored dots here, so there's some examples of it right there. And there's some on each and every pipe stem. So each of those dots indicates a location on the site where these were found. Location is hugely important for archaeologists. Mapping out artifact concentrations can give us a lot of information, as I will go into momentarily. I'm sorting all of these pipe stems by size and location, meaning almost every pipe stem gets its own category. So the ones on the right here have all been sorted. I'm about halfway through this bag, and there are 11 additional bags from the site.
Where's that site?
This is the Winslow site. These collections are housed at Plymouth Plantation, and they were excavated, I believe, in the 1970s, if I remember correctly. Sometimes more specialized techniques are needed. Archaeologists have access to technology today that was not possible decades ago. Soil chemistry can tell us how a site was used and measure approximate levels of manure in a field. Pollen analysis can tell us what sorts of plants were growing over time, which gives us information not just about humans, but also about climate change. And dendrochronology, which you can see on the left here, is the study of tree rings and can date old buildings associated with archaeological sites. Iron artifacts typically need to be conserved to prevent them from rusting, and ceramics go through additional levels of sorting. On the right is a picture of a lab in the middle of sorting ceramics. It can often take up every available flat surface. Now, some of these techniques were not available, or at least not in common use, when the homes of the Mayflower passengers were first being excavated in the late 19th and early 20th century. This slide shows a few of the people involved in early excavations of Plymouth colonists, although it is by no means all-inclusive. One of the earliest archaeological excavations of the Plymouth settlers was carried out by James Hall in 1856. Hall was a descendant of Miles Standish and wanted to conduct an archaeological investigation of his ancestors' home here in Duxbury. He managed to find the cellar hole and conduct a very thorough excavation for the time. Also, I misspoke, it was the Allerton site, not the Winslow site. I apologize. Harry Hornblower participated in and supported several archaeological digs, although he is perhaps most well known for founding Plymouth Plantation. This local living history museum today has 2 reconstructed villages, an English settlement, and a Wampanoag village. There are also exhibits and demonstrations of both native and English crafts. One of the lesser-known treasures of Plymouth Plantation, however, is its expansive archaeological collection, which does include the Winslow site, the Allerton-Cushman site, the RM site, all sorts of things. It has over a dozen archaeological sites housed on the property. This has proved invaluable for archaeologists and other scholars, and Hornblower was one of the key figures in preserving this collection. Now, another key figure in the collections at Plymouth Plantation is James Dietz. Although Hornblower was interested in archaeology, he made a living in finance. Hornblower hired Dietz in the 1950s, and Dietz excavated more than a dozen sites with students from Brown University. He wrote about these sites with his wife, Patricia Scott Dietz, in The Times of Their Lives, Life, Love, and Death in Plymouth Colony. This, along with some of Dietz's other works, became foundational for the field of historical archaeology. And finally, we get to the man of the hour, Roland Robbins. Robbins was an amateur archaeologist who had been involved in several excavations, including Saugus Ironworks and Walden Pond. Because of his reputation, the Alden Kindred of America asked him to conduct an archaeological investigation to see if he could find the Alden First Site. John Alden was about 21 in 1620 when he came to the New World on the Mayflower. He chose to stay in Plymouth, utilizing his skills as a cooper and carpenter, and married Priscilla Mullins a few years later. He served in several public roles and helped found the town of Duxbury, building a home at the Alden First Site, which Robbins discovered. He later built the Alden House, which is still standing today. He and Priscilla lived there with their 10 children. Excuse me. Now, Roland Robbins began his investigation by using a metal rod to probe for stone or brick foundation features. What he found, sketched here, is a stone foundation measuring 10.5 feet by 38 feet. The westernmost portion of this building contained a cellar that was 6.5 feet square and more than 7 feet deep. Robbins excavated this foundation thoroughly, with some additional work done within 10 feet of the foundation on all sides. The site contained a number of native artifacts indicating native occupation spanning thousands of years, as well as artifacts dating to the 17th century occupation. These 17th century finds, combined with documentation indicating that the land was owned by John Alden, suggest that Robbins had indeed found the Alden First Site. Robbins believed that this house was moved largely intact to create a portion of the still standing second Alden House. Robbins reported his findings, and the Massachusetts Historical Commission and the University of Massachusetts Amherst later created inventories of the material he excavated. Although Robbins was able to identify the first site and roughly date it, later studies have approached these materials in new ways. For instance, Mitchell-Mulholland conducted an interdisciplinary study that looked at the archaeological and architectural evidence of the first site and the current Alden home. He wanted to determine whether Robbins was correct in his assertion that the earlier home was moved intact to become part of the later home. Mulholland noted that a lot of nails were found during the excavation of the first site, suggesting that the home had rotted in place. He also studied the interior of the second Alden home and found that there were elements that appeared to be older, but they were scattered throughout the building rather than concentrated in a specific location. Because of this, he does not believe that the first home was moved fully intact. He suggests instead that the home may have been heavily damaged on site and portions of it were moved and reused in the new building. More recently, students from the University of Massachusetts Boston have been looking at the materials which Robbins collected in the 1960s. Caroline Gardner's thesis reanalyzed the ceramics from the Alden First Site. Caroline sorted all of the ceramics by their type and other diagnostic characteristics in order to determine a minimum number of vessels. This can be more useful for certain types of analysis. When you drop a plate, for instance, it can break into 2 pieces or 20 pieces. So knowing the minimum number of vessels gives us a better idea of how many dishes they had, rather than knowing the number of sherds. Only some of these pieces will make it into the ground, and they're exposed to the elements and broken up by frost. And trying to piece them back together is a little like putting together a bunch of yard sale puzzles that have all been mixed up. You have to look at the characteristics for each sherd to determine what type of ceramic it was, or what puzzle it came from. This slide shows one of the vessels which Caroline reconstructed, an Iberian storage jar. Caroline found that most of the vessels were inexpensive, utilitarian ceramics that would have been used for day-to-day activities. These ceramics were not only related to cooking and eating, but also to other activities such as dairying and storage. However, the Aldens did appear to have some expensive decorated wares, both English and foreign. This slide shows a Chinese porcelain vessel. 2 of the 3 sherds men, and all 3 probably came from the same vessel based on their common characteristics. These 3 sherds may have originally been part of a wine cup and could have been owned by the Aldens. These were expensive because they were so fine and so highly decorated. Similar wine cups have been found in Jamestown. If Alden did own this wine cup, it would have been a symbol of his prestigious position in Plymouth Colony. In addition to her reanalysis of ceramics, Caroline also studied the spatial layout of the Alden First Site, using a software called ArcGIS, which allows for new types of mapping and spatial analysis. Caroline mapped the ceramics, window glass, and nails that were found during Robbins' excavation. The map of the window glass showed a concentration that may have been the location of a window. There was also a concentration of nails and window glass in the center of the building that are the result of demolition of the building, further reinforcing the idea that the first site was not moved all in one piece. There were also concentrations of small ceramics along the wall which may have indicated small pieces being swept to one side. Sweeping was usually done towards a back door, so this may indicate the location of the back of the house. The map here shows the distribution of all ceramics. This is clearly skewed by the presence of the cellar, which you can see right here. When you remove the cellar, the concentration of ceramics along the top of this map becomes much clearer. You can see some of that right up in here. Perhaps one of the most interesting aspects of Caroline's thesis is the possibility that the house was larger than originally believed. Robbins noted when he originally excavated the first site that the building shape was very unusual. Caroline's work indicates that an addition was built to one side, which would have added 2 rooms. The second Alden house, pictured here, has a similar structure. The Winslow and Standish houses also had this structure, called a tripartite floor plan. There was a depression in the center of the building, which Robbins thought might be a possible hearth, and the ceramics in the center of the room were used for all different activities. This suggests that there was a central, multi-purpose room consistent with a tripartite floor plan rather than 2 rooms which would have been divided into different purposes. This is a really interesting theory with a lot of statistical data to back it up, so it is certainly worth pursuing further. While Caroline's work is complete, there is still more being done on the Alden collections. Grace Bellow, who is pictured here, is studying the window glass at the Alden site using an X-ray fluorescence machine. This machine, which I will hereafter refer to as XRF, measures the chemical signature of all kinds of materials. For glass fragments from the 17th century, the chemical of importance is strontium. Glass production houses in England moved during the 17th century from inland to coastal regions. During this move, the flux agent, which helps the molten glass flow, changed from charcoal to kelp. Most glass houses began to change the flux agent for their glass around 1675 or so. This gives archaeologists the ability to date the glass from archaeological sites to portions of the 17th century. The Alden First Home collection has 884 fragments of flat glass. After initial processing, a preliminary hypothesis has been established about the numerous fragments found during the excavation. There is evidence that window glass fragments exist in the collection from both before and after this recipe change. This could suggest that the Alden family was altering their home either leading up to or after John Alden Sr.'s death in 1687. I am also currently working with materials from the Alden House. Archaeologists working on other 17th century English colonies such as Fairyland, Barbados, and Jamestown have noted that wealthier members of the colony were able to establish relationships with foreign traders that weren't necessarily within English trading regulations. For example, a woman in Fairyland named Sarah Kirk took over trade after her husband died. She was given a set of dishes with her initials on them as a gift for maintaining good trade relationships, even though the traders were not sanctioned by the English government. I am hoping to determine whether similar networks were being established in Plymouth. To do this, I'm going to look at ceramics from 3 sites. One of these sites is the Alden First Site, building off of Caroline's reanalysis. The other 2 sites are the Winslow Home Site, which was excavated in the 1940s, and Burial Hill in downtown Plymouth. Burial Hill is currently being excavated under the direction of Drs. Krista Bronick and David Landon. Originally known as Fort Hill, it is the site of the original Plymouth settlement. Because it is located under the modern town, archaeologists have had to look in locations which may not have been disturbed since the 17th century. The Fiske Center at UMass Boston conducted ground penetrating radar to ensure that we would not disturb any of the burials and found an undisturbed area near a 19th century crypt along School Street. This summer, the excavation uncovered the remains of a structure that may have belonged to either John Alden or Miles Standish. So it's really exciting work. Burial Hill is the earliest site being tied to the original fort. The Winslow and Alden sites were both established later when these families moved out of Plymouth to establish their own homesteads. I plan to look at the imported ceramics from each site, which can be distinguished by differences in design, composition, and color, among other characteristics. And this slide just gives you an example of some of those imported ceramics. I'm looking to see whether changes in English trade and regulation affected where the colonists were buying their ceramics from. If it did, then this does not match with the patterns of other sites. It is possible that some characteristics of Plymouth caused them to stray from the pattern identifier. Perhaps they did not have the same access to resources, or they had different priorities from other English colonies. All of this will be determined through a combination of lab work, mapping artifact distributions, and diving into the historical documents. I hope that my talk today has shed light on the behind-the-scenes archaeological processes that not a lot of people get to see or interact with. Although I really love field work, archaeology is a lot more than just digging in the ground. It is truly a destructive science. Once we dig up a site, we can never put the dirt and artifacts back in the same way. However, there are always different questions to be asked by new generations of scholars, and new techniques to answer them. Some of the things I have discussed today would not have been possible when Robbins first excavated the Alden First Site. Only by studying the artifacts in detail, utilizing new technologies, and recording what we have found can we make the time spent in the field truly worthwhile. Now, do we have time for questions, or do we want to put that off? Does anyone have questions? Okay, thank you very much. Pointer is here, and then slides are there. Took me a second to figure out.
Hi folks, I'm Mark Jacobson. I'm not an archaeology professional, although when I was a wee kid, I thought that's what I was going to wind up doing. I hoped that that's what I was going to wind up doing. Maybe one day before I become horizontal, I'll be able to do that. But it's been a lifelong fascination for me. I did some master's work around locating sites, not just in Duxbury, but in the greater New England area where pilgrims migrated after what William Bradford called a diaspora in 1627, 1628, when all the grants were made up and down the coast, and people went and established their own farms, established their own meeting houses that separated themselves a little bit from Plymouth and set up. Today I'd kind of like to talk a little bit about what's here in Duxbury, both in terms of what we know. Elizabeth and Desiree have shared what's known about probably the most famous archaeological site in Duxbury, the John Alden First Site, which I hope everyone will get a chance to go take a look at. I remember as a kid going back there when that cellar hole was open and sitting there. I think there was probably some problems with vandalism or whatever, and they soon covered it over. But it is still a very, very real site along the Duxborough Path. Are you folks familiar with the Duxborough Path? Back in colonial days, the way people, pilgrims, and before them, the Wampanoags, and even before them, the way they got north and south were along paths. And when the pilgrims got here, when they arrived in Plymouth, the Patuxets, which were the branch of the Wampanoags that were local, had been wiped out by smallpox with contact with people like Thomas Durner down on the Cape, and it spread like wildfire, pretty much wiped out all of them. But they had created paths from here to what became Greens Harbor and Marshfield, north up towards Boston, south along Sandwich Street to Cape Cod, etc., that they would traverse. So the pilgrims kind of inherited this, so they didn't have to clear the land. They took advantage of that because those paths followed by water sources. They were aligned to where crossroads became, and so the pilgrims kind of took after what the Native Americans had already done and built their homes along the Duxborough Path. And we're going to talk about that today. One of the things that I do now with great joy is I'm on the board of Duxbury 2020, which is our town's answer to Plymouth 400. Not answer, but we work closely together with Plymouth 400 and the Alden House Historical Site to try to bring some real history back, awareness, elevate the awareness of pilgrim history here in Duxbury. And one of the things that I find fascinating, of the 50 Mayflower pilgrims, and there were really, maybe there were 50-51, of those remaining individuals who survived the first winter, who made it into like what we now know as the first Thanksgiving, 11 of them, fully 11 of them, came to this town, Duxbury, which later became Duxbury in 1637, to live either all or part of the rest of their lives. So this functionally was America's first summer colony. The way that the Pilgrim law was, you had to go to meeting on Sunday, and if you didn't, there were, you know what to pay. You could be excommunicated, whatever. So at least on Sunday, folks had to go to church. They also knew that the first 7 years of the colony's history, the way that the colonists would repay the debt of the people who had made the investment in their, in the settlement, was to send back furs, send back a number of items that were wanted and needed in England. In 1626, 27, 28, a group called the Undertakers bought out those folks back in England. And then what happened was there became more local rule. And one of the first things that happened with that local rule was William Bradford, all the colonial leaders said, if we allow people to take advantage and benefit from their own hard labor, chances are we're all going to be a much more successful colony. So that kind of started the whole America home ownership dream. Colonists in 1627, 8, and 9 were granted 100 acres each along the coastline, typically along one or more of the paths, like the old Duxbury path, and we'll talk about that a little bit. And they were free to come and go. Until 1637, they had to go back in the wintertime to be able to go to church in Plymouth. In 1636, there was enough of a population here, and the government in Plymouth said, you can put together your own meeting. They built a structure at Chestnut Street where the old burial ground was, and then a year after that, Duxbury became a town of its own, and people could come live here on a permanent basis. Before that, 1627, 28 to 1637, people would come up and farm a lot of this land, but then they go back to Plymouth, where they probably still had a home along Leiden Street or to the south or to the north, where they practiced. That to me is a fascinating statistic that our town here hosted 11 of the 50 remaining. No other town in the colony came close to that. Now this was also close, but even some of the, what is now known as Kingston land grants had 4 or 5 other Mayflower pilgrims that went and moved to land on what is now Kingston, but back then, that part of Kingston on this side of the Jones River was also Duxbury. So those aren't counted in the 11 as we move forward. But let me kind of go through and give you a synopsis, and I could talk all day about this stuff. This is my passion. I've got more notes at home and pictures, and I've even got recordings of when Mrs. Wentworth. Do any of you remember Mrs. Dorothy Wentworth, the town historian? Yeah, she was really something. She was the first kind of took me under when I was in school, took me under her wing and said, no market was here. Well, what about that source? That source is wrong. It was over here. So I learned one heck of a lot, and so that kind of spurred me on to do a little bit more research. Alden Brewster, probably one of the 2 or 3 most famous Duxbury residents. We really don't know whether he really was a full-time resident here. We know that he had a 100-acre lot along Marshall Street near the head of Bradford Street. So about halfway down Standish Shore. If anyone been back to the Brewster Lilacs, and you may have heard that Duxbury Rural Historical Society funded a dig on what was purported to be the site back in 2012. What they found was an outline of an 18th century house, but the more digging we did, we found the hearth and the foundations inside of that 1700s house, which was the house that was built during the lifetime of Elder Brewster. We think that he came here in the summer, we think he came here, but we think largely that structure along Marshall Street was built for his son, Love, who we'll talk about in a minute, who was his eldest son who inherited the property and who married very, very well. But that site has been confirmed. The Historical Society has many artifacts from that dig in 2012. Maybe someone was here, participated in that dig. It was a community-wide dig sponsored by the Historical Society, but executed by Plymouth Rediscovery, Archaeological Rediscovery Project, a fellow by the name of Craig Chartier, who is now working with Duxbury 2020 on a couple of other projects. So, question? Elder Brewster was one. Love Brewster. He was the son of Elder. He was probably a small boy when he came over in the Mayflower. There were other Brewsters. His mother and Elder's wife died in 1627 before there was a grant in Duxbury, so we believe that she died and is buried in Plymouth. Love Brewster married Sarah Collier, and those of you who have heard the name William Collier was Plymouth Colony's Bill Gates. He became the treasurer, he became involved in a lot of the finances, was a key person in this undertaker group that bought out the investors back in England. He married very, very well, but he went to this site in Duxbury. He was, again, 5, 6 years old maybe when he came over. But when he came of age, he moved full-time into that house along Marshall Street with his wife. His father-in-law, Collier, the records also show, gave them a plot of land. I can't recall what the acreage was, but it's on the North Hill Golf Course. So that's undiscovered yet. We don't know where that was, and we don't know if they ever went there to live. It's more likely because the topography down in Standish Shore didn't lend itself to farming, that could have been a farm out there. But there is a Love Brewster Mayflower Pilgrim site somewhere off the grounds, I don't know which hole, but on the North Hill Golf Course out there. Love Brewster lived all of his life, as far as we know, in Duxbury, probably in that house, died 1650. There's no reason to believe he's not buried in the old burial ground. The old burial ground was started probably, certainly by 1637 when the first meeting house was built there. And there really weren't any deaths prior to that because there weren't any full-time residents there. Anybody who might have passed away before 1637, he probably was either brought back to Plymouth or passed in Plymouth. But Love Brewster is buried in that old burial ground, in my estimation. There's no marker there. There are Brewster graves that from descendants who were alive when Love was alive, so it's possible to be able to triangulate because families did bury their family members among each other. It's possible that his grave could be someone.
The old burial ground is often referred to as one of the oldest maintained, or
Yes.
the oldest maintained cemetery in the country.
Yeah.
Why isn't Burial Hill older?
It's older, but the technicality is maintained. It's maintained by the town by referendum. I don't know what the date was, but it's always been a maintained cemetery. Now, this being
Does that mean
said,
people are still buried in it? Or?
no. I think the most recent burial there was 1820 or something. If you go there now, there's probably 20% of the markers that once existed there. This Craig Chartier fellow I mentioned has done some ground penetrating radar in there. There's a lot of stones underneath the surface. He's also found the real site of the first meeting house, which is not where the marker says it was. I'll get to that in a minute. There are 5 or 6 Mayflower pilgrims that are buried in that burial ground. We'll get into that as well. So it's basically a continually maintained, but back in before 1890, before the Miles Standish thing came around, cows grazed there, knocked over the stones. People took the stones and put them in their walls, put them in the flagstones for their porch and all that. Priceless artifacts. The oldest gravestone is 1697. John Alden's son. We'll get into that in a little bit. The presence and location of his grave gave the Alden kindred an opportunity to say, "Hey, John and Priscilla are nearby." Richard Moore. I put him along with the Brewsters. This guy was a character, big time. There was a book about 10 years ago written, and pardon my French, but this is the actual title, Richard Moore, Mayflower Bastard. Richard Moore was among 3 children who were illegitimate sons of, I've forgotten his last name, who was connected to the royal family at the time, but illegitimately so. And it was a great embarrassment. So what happened was the investors took those kids at age, I think probably Richard was probably 5 years old at the time, he was the oldest, and assigned them to families and got them out of Dodge, put them on the Mayflower and get them out of here because this is too much of a scandal. Richard was assigned to the Brewster household. So he kind of became a son of Elder Brewster. And Elder Brewster was again granted over 100 acres in South Duxbury. We know that the part he then deeded to Richard as a young man on the contingency he could go live and build there when he got married is up where Eagle's Nest Creek Point is today. So if you go over down off of Marshall Street, as it bangs to the right real hard over to the left, is the land that originally was going to be given to Richard Moore. So we don't know, we don't know where the home site could have been. We don't even know if there was a home site. Probably not. But that was his land behind the large colonial house all the way up to the point. He married in 1636 and moved to Salem and became a mariner. Oh gosh, he was in court for being a bigamist. He was a colorful guy. But he became a Massachusetts Bay. He was in and out of the church up there, in the meeting up there. He was a colorful guy. He lived to about 1694. His gravestone at the Charter Street burial point in Salem is the only known original Mayflower Pilgrim gravestone. So you can go see that original stone. Somebody around 1890 put a Mayflower Pilgrim carved in the bottom of the stone, but that's the original stone. It's embedded in a larger piece of slate. And his home is also marked by a boulder in front of the old Lydia Pinkham Memorial in the corner of Derby and Congress Streets. So he lived to see the Winchester in Salem in 1692, and then gone. So, but he came to Duxbury as early as anyone else did as a young man. Miles Standish. Elizabeth told a little bit about in the 1850s, the Halls, who were descendants, found the cellar hole at the end of Mayflower Street in South Duxbury, in the Nook area, overlooking Plymouth, right up on top of the hill, found the cellar hole and excavated it. One of the first pieces of archaeology in America. Is that true, Elizabeth? That was one of the first, I don't know if you'd say it was a professional,
Not
but
necessarily one of the first. Thomas Jacobson, for instance, had been doing archaeology before that, but it was a really good piece of scholarship
Yeah.
at the time.
Yeah.
It was very well done.
What's interesting, a little bit on that, Craig Chardia of, we call it PARP, Plymouth Archaeological Rediscovery Project, did some ground penetrating radar down there about 4 years ago. Found evidence that the structure that was unearthed in the 1850s wasn't the only thing down there, that there was in all likelihood an L off of that building. Unfortunately, during the early 1900s, the town put a pipe drain from Mayflower Street to go into the bay and took with it a lot of it. But there was going to be enough to unearth. The town said it was okay to do a dig. The state of Massachusetts said no, because it had already been dug on 100 and some odd years prior to that. There was nothing of prominence to find, so they denied, my understanding is that they denied permission to do the additional dig. But that property was bigger than what it looks like today. It would make perfect sense. They didn't have a large family, but it was that cellar hole down there was very small, much smaller even than the Alden House. There's also, archaeologists never make assumptions. I'm not an archaeologist, so I get to do this. Some secondary sources, albeit in the Victorian era when all of this was romanticized, feel that Hobbamock, one of the first Native American Wampanoag leaders who fell in with the Pilgrims, is buried on Miles Standish's land. We know that he lived with Miles Standish the last 15 years of his life and died in Duxbury in 1644. They think that he couldn't be buried in the consecrated ground, even though he had declared himself a Christian. There are many who feel that somewhere on that property down there is the grave of Hobbamock. Miles Standish's grave site was not known, at least through any primary records, but in the 1890s, one of the ministers of the local church, I believe it was the Episcopal Church, the Episcopal, the Congregational Church, a fellow by the name of Queequin, did some research, kind of like me, he wasn't a professional archaeologist, whatever, he just dug, and found not only in the records, but interviewed people, elderly people in the town where tradition had been passed down, and it was found in the records that Miles Standish was buried supposedly under a pyramidal shaped stone between his daughter and his daughter-in-law. So he caused an archaeological dig to happen underneath. They went out and dug the grass away, it was overgrown, found the pyramidal stone, took pictures of it, there's pictures of it before it was dug down about 5 feet and found a skeleton of a man about 5'6" with red hair, beard, so on and so forth, with some military regalia. DNA wasn't available then, but they kind of thought they had something. They put him back. A couple of years later, they did a more extensive dig because they wanted to see was the daughter and the daughter-in-law on two sides, and indeed they found the skeletons of 2 women of proper age, where they should have been based upon what the records and oral history was. They put them back, and then in 1931, they dug them all up again, looked at it, took pictures, took fragments of his hair, that exists, I believe, over the Historical Society, parts of his coffin, and then put his remains in a lead box and reburied it. There is some conversation now that they might want to do it again to get some DNA analysis, but there's a little bit of pushback on that. You've probably been over to the burial ground and seen what's there now. They put a boulder there, I guess 1905, 1910, surrounded with Civil War era cannons, and have done a good job of interpreting the site recently. So is it 100% him? We're not sure. I think everything checks out as much as possible. I think even modern scholarship would agree, yeah, it probably is him. Sometimes some of the things that the conclusions they came to in the 1880s after Longfellow wrote the Courtship of Mouse Standard was fun stuff, and then the fun stuff became fact. And I think archaeology has dispelled some of those hypotheses since, but not necessarily that one. Miles Standish. Francis Eaton is kind of an interesting lad. Came over in the Mayflower. His wife died the first winter. He became the second fella to marry after Edward Winslow and Susanna Winslow. We don't know who he married. We think he married one of Governor Carver's maids. But he lived long enough to get one of those 100-acre land grants in South Duxbury, and the position of that land grant was south of the Brewster along Marshall Street, north of the Miles Standish. So if we got in the car and drove down and tried to say about where was this lot, it's about where Massasoit Street and Marshall Street meet, in that general area, a little bit to the north. Now, what happened was that Francis Eaton died in 1633 before he could come and live full-time there. There's evidence that he did use that land. There was a building there. He used that land for farm prior to his death. He probably died 1633. There was an outbreak of some disease in the fall of 1633. He passed in Plymouth, probably buried there. He had a young son we'll talk about next. And during his life and during the life of his son, that parcel got sold off piece by piece by piece, mostly to the Brewsters to expand their footprint. And the Brewster house, it is felt, is on land either on the original Francis Eaton grant or abutting it. So that Brewster house would be on the southern fringe, southeastern fringe of the larger Brewster grant. Could have been on original Brewster lands. Samuel Eaton was his son, and he was, I think Bradford called him a suckling child, so he was 1, 2, 3 maybe, when he came over in the Mayflower. His mother died the first winter. His father, again, died when he was only 13, and he was apprenticed to Pilgrim John Cook, who had a home over towards Rocky Nook, which was still Plymouth, even until it became Kingston. It was Plymouth. It was never part of Duxbury, but it wasn't that far away. He was apprenticed to him, but by 1646, the records show he was full-time resident of Duxbury, and most historians believe he lived on at least a small part of the original acreage of his family, because he sold, when he was married in 1660, he sold that, I've forgotten who he sold it to, but when he married Martha, the daughter of another pilgrim, Francis Billington, he sold it into the Brewster family. And there were a lot of lawsuits over what's the boundary between our two land grants that went back to Elder Brewster's days all the way up to the point where he finally sold off that last parcel. But again, that's about Massasoit Street and Marshall Street. No one's ever found where the house is. It's heavily built over now. There's a real question of whether we could find it. If probably, you know, the best we could hope for would be in someone's backyard or close to it. He married in 1661, moved to Middleborough, one of the first planters of Middleborough, 26 man's purchase in the North Pottertown, north of 44, along Route 105. Is where the original settlers of Middleborough, and he was one of them. He died in Middleborough, probably buried up in the Mascot Hill burial ground, a current cemetery. It's the oldest one in town, but it was expanded, it's still being used, unmarked. George Soule, a big, or Sewell, I'm corrected many times, the correct pronunciation is Sewell. He was an important early settler. He was granted his acreage out in Powder Point, and over his lifetime, he died in 1679 or 80, depending upon old or new calendar. He acquired most all of Powder Point, with a small exception of the land just west of where the King Caesar's house now. That part stayed in Washburn and other hands, but the rest of the whole peninsula became sold territory and ownership. No one knows, and my first meeting with Dorothy Wentworth back in the 1800s, it seems like that, was about where was George Soule, because there was a fellow, Henry Fish, in 1924, who had a theory. The deed said one thing. His home site has never been found. Now, it's built out there. Some of our local historians feel like he probably would have built his house out at the end overlooking the beach. That's what we would do, right? But his land grant started on the western end of Powder Point. He died in 1679, and at that time, Soule kindred triangulated Soule graves in the old burial ground and made the assumption that George would have been buried near people whose stones still are extant in the burial ground. Those who were alive when he was buried in 1679, didn't die in 1679, but they were at least alive and of cognitive age to be able to say, you know, they probably buried him nearby. So there's a stone out there, erected, I think 1971, that says, near this spot lies Mayflower, Pilgrim, George Soule. Peter Brown came over to the Mayflower alone. Was connected to an important family back in England. He was granted 100 acres along Duxbury Path. And I'm going to get next into this whole Duxbury Path thing and why it's an important part of our history. It's kind of gone unnoticed. His land was bounded, importantly, Washington Street, as we know. We think Washington Street is maybe one of the older streets in Duxbury. It isn't. It was laid out in 1801 and wasn't completed until 1803. The east-west roads like Surplus, Stetson, a lot of those, Partridge, those were earlier roads that led off of what was Duxbury Path. Duxbury Path paralleled Washington Street, but about 2 football fields to the west. So if you took a line where the clubhouse of the yacht club golf course and drew straight to the south to Surplus Street, that's kind of the line of Duxbury Path. And you can see that south of the parking lot of the current pool of the Duxbury Yacht Club. You can see part of the path is still there. It's not traversable the whole way. One of the things Duxbury 2020 is doing is we're trying to see if we can open that up a little bit for people to follow, because people like John Alden, George Soule, who lived in the north part, they had to come down that path to go to the meeting house, which was situated in the middle of the borough ground. So a lot of history there. He died in 1633, about the same time Francis Eaton did, probably in Plymouth, probably buried in Plymouth. And when he died, he gave his 100 acres in 3 separate lots to his 3 daughters. The oldest daughter owned the northernmost part, which was north of Surplus Street, west of Washington Street, north of Surplus Street. That land was sold in, I believe, 1647 to Pilgrim Henry Sampson, that we're going to talk about next, just to the north. Yes?
Was it unusual at that time for daughters to inherit all of the property of their
Not
father?
in the New World. In the Old World, very much so, but he didn't have any sons. And I think in some cases that was frowned upon if there was no husband, but his oldest daughter indeed had a husband, Ephraim Tinkham. So they inherited the land, and Ephraim Tinkham is on the deed to Henry Sampson, not the daughter. But her part was the northernmost part, and historians believe that Peter Brown's house was on that northernmost part. So we think Peter Brown's house is somewhere north of Surplus, along Surplus Street on the north side. There's a little path that goes up, that's not the Pilgrim path, but somewhere just to the north, to the south of what we're going to talk about next. He is buried probably on Burial Hill. He died in 1633 in Plymouth. I was able to link back, I found this deed from Tinkham to Sampson. It's in the records. So really, Henry Sampson's lot became much larger. Pilgrim Henry Sampson's lot became much larger than the 100 because he bought up adjacent lands. And those lands went from the bay on the east side all the way out west beyond Duxborough Path into what is now the maintenance area for the golf course owned by the Duxbury Yacht Club. And here's a little bit more of a map to talk about. This is, if I can ask you, this is Surplus Street. This is the, come on, Mark. This is Surplus Street, Washington Street. The Duxborough Path came up this way. And here's the golf course with the Sprague Barn, which is now the clubhouse of the golf course. And you'll notice that Duxborough Path followed the line to the east of the Bluefish River. The Bluefish River back then was the freshwater source. So pilgrims tended to build their homes on hillocks close to water sources and close to the path, so they didn't have to forage up a hill or whatever, close to the path. We think that Peter Brown's house is somewhere right in this vicinity right here, along the path, on the east part of the path. It's never been explored. This comes from PARP, Craig Charney, who's done some deed search and done some physical search along we walk the path. Everything we've been able to pull together suggests that this is the site. Probably a small house. He probably never lived in it full time. His daughter did. So again, here's Surplus Street down here. Stetson Place, right there. Somewhere in this vicinity right here. John Alden, I won't get into a whole lot of that. My two predecessors did a wonderful job, but he built his house over here on a hillock. Bluefish River headwaters were his freshwater source. He moved his family there part-time, 1627, was there full-time by the 1630s. Left his house in Plymouth and abandoned it, from what I understand. Isn't that correct? That he just got up and left. I don't know where the house went, but they're digging on that site now. He's almost certainly buried at the old burial ground there. In his will, he wanted to be buried adjacent to his son, Jonathan, and people, although Jonathan's gravestone was taken up when a lot of vandalism was in the 1800s, taken up, was put back, and the Alden kindred was able to put two stones up, one in memory of John and one in memory of Priscilla. Unfortunately, when ground penetrating radar went out there, they're not buried exactly with the stones. There's nothing underneath those stones, but it's pretty sure that they're 5 or 6 feet away somewhere in one direction or another. Same thing with Priscilla. You know, like everything else, unfortunately, the books and the records don't really pay a lot of attention to the women. Heck, they built the colony, they kept it going, but they didn't get a lot of ink, which was the standard of the time, I guess. But she's probably buried right next to John in their lives, obviously parallel. Here's a little bit more of where the Duxborough Path was, right along here, overlaid on today's landscape. So when Peter Brown around Surplus Street, up here, Henry Sampson, we're going to talk in a minute, probably on the western extension of Western Way. Henry Howland was on the grounds of the current golf course, and then up to the John Alden grant in the path. Fairway Drive is the Duxboro path that went into the grounds of the golf course up north, and there's another part of the path north going south over here. You can walk down at dead ends of the golf course, but that's the way that John Alden walked to the meeting house. Last but not least, let's talk about what Duxbury 2020 is doing. Trying to find the exact home site of Pilgrim Henry Sampson, who came over in the Mayflower, signed the compact, and lived in Duxbury till his death in 1684. His home site has been approximated at least since 1924, when Henry Fish did a lot of deed research, but it's never been pinpointed. So I kind of spearheaded the thing and talked to the Sampson kindred into funding some archaeological work. We did most of our work at the deeds, at the libraries, for about a year to try to look and see what's a logical spot. We know that most pilgrim houses were built on a hillock, not on flat ground, not on a depression. They were built near water, they were built near the path. Where might his land be? The Henry Sampson grant, Monty Healy, I don't know if Monty Healy has been involved in Duxbury 2020, is by trade a surveyor, did a lot of deed research, has written and has had articles in the Clipper about Pilgrim history. He was able to trace back and almost pinpoint the boundaries of Sampson's lot. Went from east on the waterfront to an east-west line just north of the Windsor House, all the way onto the land of where the maintenance building for the golf course is. So over the Bluefish River, over the Duxboro Path, and further out. And on the south side, by east-west line, just north of where Stetson Place is. So when you eat at the Windsor House, you're on Henry Sampson land. So we try to figure out where in the world on that land could he have had his house. I'm going to pass out here, handout one. I'm going to leave you with a report that was done by Craig Chartier before we started getting down on our hands and knees and doing some digs and doing some tests and doing some GPR on how we synthesized, how we triangulated where we thought we needed to look. That process has had its ups and downs. It's not quite done yet. There's one really good spot that we haven't done any GPR yet. But I'll be happy to pass this out in a little bit. This is a picture on Henry Sampson's grant looking up north. Right up here is what is now the new Duxbury Yacht Club pool. And unfortunately, that new pool is right smack dab in the middle of where the Duxbury path would have fallen. So anything archaeological is lost there. I mean, it's right perfectly aligned. This picture was taken before that new pool went out, but this is the actual trail. You can walk about 100 yards of it. To the south is just a little fence, and it stops some 200 yards north of Surplus Street and goes all the way up to the parking lot of the yacht club. So this is south looking north. We believe that Pilgrim Henry Sampson's home site is about right over here. In this document, this is the work where we trace that deed from Henry Sampson's ownership all the way up to the current owners, who have been very gracious in allowing to go on our land. We even tore up part of their backyard and put it back very nicely, but, in search of a couple clues that wound up to be false alarms. But you might have some interest when you look at that. That's typically how archaeologists tend to find where in the bigger landscape is found. This is the general area that we're exploring now. Here's the path, here's the waterfront, Windsor Street, so Windsor House is probably sorry about That's the area that we found. So we were able to try, before we even took the GPR machine out, before we did metal detection, we kind of tried to triangulate it within 50 square yards. Here's Western Way. Right here is where we know there was a 1790s house called the Joseph Soul House that was owned by the yacht club, sold to the yacht club, knocked down in 1979. Right here is where we believe the original Henry Sampson site may have been. There's actually a foundation out there that, being the unscholarly archaeologist that I was, I went out there one time, and of course there was a foundation. You know, if it was that easy, it would have been found years ago, but I got excited about what happened. I went to a great clue my guess. Henry Fish, I don't know if you're familiar with that name, Henry Fish. This is a guy in 1924 that exhaustively looked at the deeds. And most modern scholarship has proven him right 99% of the time. His book was republished by the DRHS about, 3 or 4 or 5 years ago with a map to allow people to show. Most of this is on private land. The Sampson House is on private land, so it's not a place that you can go take a look at. But we believe that, again, the Henry Sampson House is on a small knoll on the property of 77 Western Way. Whether it's on the footprint of the old Joseph Soul House that was built in 1797 or nearby is yet to be determined. We haven't explored the site. This is the only site we haven't explored. We found some things over here that we kind of thought. We found a couple of 17th century bricks and actually an upholstery tack and a few other things. So we did some test digs here, but we thought we saw a foundation of GPR. It was in fact an old inoperable septic system, probably from that 1797 Joseph Soul House that was knocked down in 1979. When we did this dig, we then learned that the builder of the current home that was built in 1984 came forward and told us that the Joseph Soul House, before it was knocked down, was situated on the spot where the current 77 Western Way garage now rests, which means there's nothing to be discovered if there's nothing to be discovered of the Soul House, and if the Soul in Sampson House was similar to the Brewster situation where the 17th century house foundation was inside an 18th century foundation, we're going to hit a dead end as far as being able to pinpoint anything. So here's what we did. After we did all this stuff, all this research, we went out, did a walkthrough. What are the most likely places? We looked at the deeds, where the different paths went. We looked at the path from Duxbury path down to the water source. Where would it logically be based upon what we know about other pilgrim sites? So we figured out 4 spots. We've exhausted 3, 1 more to go. Metal detection didn't come up with a whole lot. Ground penetrating radar, we were all excited. We saw a 10 by 12 with a foundation corner on it. Again, it was a septic. We were heartbroken with the septic system. So to the west and the north of the current house at 77 Western Way, which is a very large expanse, it's a beautiful property. It's a house built in 1984. We didn't find a heck of a lot up there. We found septic tank. We found some iron anomalies out there. Again, here, during this process, we were told by the builder of the 1984 house that the Soul House was on what is now the garage. Craig Chartier of PARP and I kind of differ a little bit. He doesn't think that the Sampson House would have been built on the footprint of the later Soul House or vice versa. But that was true of Brewster findings. So I don't think it's we'll know more after we take a look at that last. So if indeed the Sampson House was built on what later was the Joseph Soul House, we're not going to be able to find anything definitive. but we know that it is in proximity. In Duxbury 2020, if that's the solution, we'll probably approach the Sampson kindred and ask them if they'd like to put a plaque up on the property saying nearby was his home site. Because he was a very important early Mayflower pilgrim. So here's the home. The driveway comes up here. This right here is the garage. This is where the builder said the Joseph Soul House was. This was land that GPR found was disturbed with an existing septic tank for the new property, which would be expected. It was built in modern times. Anything that had been there or was there has likely been built, has been dug over. We did, however, find quite a few, 6, 7 pieces, not quite a few, 17th century items up in here. And this was the original spot where we thought the building might be, because this is a knoll. Over here is the water source. This is the part right in here that we haven't explored. And this has all the characteristics, high, closer to the water, not too far from the...
How did the builder in the 80s get permission to disturb such?
That building had been torn down in 1979.
Well, I know that, but the foundation was still there, so how did he get permission from the town to disturb what was already known as a...
I think probably back then there wasn't the kind of restrictions.
Yeah, my house had been severely vandalized.
Yeah, it was empty for years and years and years and years. And there was a woman that had lived there, I think in the 20s and 30s, that basically squatted on the property, and after 30 years came to the town and said, I should have the deed of this because I've lived on the property. But then it was empty. It was a place I know where some people on our board said they used to go fool around.
Well, yeah, I
and see
just didn't know how that, if it's such an important site that, they got built over and disturbed.
Yeah, that just happened with the pool over the Duxbury path. So, and there was some squawking about, gee, don't we have a procedure here to make sure we're not destroying history?
A lot of those ponds there too were man-made.
Yeah, because it was wasteland there for a while. They had to recut them.
Right.
I can answer to your question a little bit. So there is legislation in place, and it would have been in the 1980s, but the legislation basically says that if there is federal money or a federal permit or it's on federal land involved, then you have to go through a process of archaeological investigation. If none of that is the case, if it's on private property, you can do what you like.
Oh, okay.
So if you don't have any of those federal involvements, then you do have the right to tear something down or to build something where a site would have been. Now the exception to that is native materials, native burials specifically. Those have further protections, but for a historic house, it would.
This is a picture before it was torn down, probably from the 1880s, from the collection of local author and illustrator Norm Forget, who's on our 2020 board. This is the Soul House. I'm not sure exactly when. This is because this is known to be a schoolhouse that faced Washington Street. We know that this is facing east, so the front of the house faced east. This L back here looks to be predate this part. We don't know whether this part or this part was built on the footprint of the Henry Sampson house, but that's what we're working on now. One of the concerns we have is this house is known to be on Washington Street. It looks awfully close than Washington Street really is. Now that could be a 19th century photographic anomaly, but this is the Soul House, and the garage of 77 Washington Way. The rest of the property comes down here, and there's a lagoon down here, and it's a beautiful property. I wonder whether maybe this part, not discoverable because again, around the garage was heavily disturbed. This is what the house looks like now. From the north let's see, from the northwest looking to the southeast. There's the garage right over here. So the Sill House was sat right over here. The anomaly that I mentioned that we thought, this part over here was disturbed soil, but over here there was a section that had not been disturbed in at least 100 years. That's where we found what we thought, what we hoped was the foundation, and it wound up being an old septic. So we think this old septic served this old, so we don't know that, but it is not, the current house's septic system is right here. This was over here, and there's a 1 by 2 foot iron anomaly that we still haven't figured out what it is. We're not even sure how to date it.
There used to be an old outhouse up there.
Yeah. It could have been, yeah. Probably, so we don't know. So this is still in process. We've certainly not hit pay dirt like we hoped and anticipated. We got our hopes up when we found that foundation in the ground with corners to it. It didn't quite work out that way, but another opportunity, like with the way the Souls did, like the Alden Kindred did, is for Pilgrim Henry Sampson to be memorialized in the old burial ground. There are some Sampson stones, not many, 3 I believe, from the 18th century that are in the burial ground, but he lies in that cemetery unmarked and unheralded. Interestingly enough, ground penetrating radar, as I mentioned earlier, did a very thorough scan of the old burial ground because it just didn't make sense where the 1920 centenary marker was placed in the southeast portion of the old burial ground in relation to what was more recently found to be the second meeting house, and that was supposed to be 60 yards from the first. Craig found just to the south of the current Standish plot the only part of the burial ground that had no burial shafts, and within it at least 2 corners with foundations, and it's on the highest part, the highest elevation by maybe 10 feet in the burial ground. We believe that that's where the first meeting house was, not some 40 feet to 50 feet to the southeast. So, there's a marker in the burial ground. It's not entirely inaccurate, but it doesn't pinpoint. We don't think the accuracy. I think that's about it. Questions? I've overextended my stay. Questions? You see, you know about the Solomite.
Well, yeah, I remember it. My parents lived on Stetson Place. I live on Stetson Place. There used to be literally a sandbank. And you mentioned a road. There was a dirt road that was outlined by large fir trees. And as a kid, I actually came across an old dump. Started to, as a kid, dig into it and pulled up a Civil War belt buckle.
Oh, wonderful. Wow.
Yeah, and there used to be, the Taylor Farm used to be located in that vicinity. But I do remember walking around that house. I do remember that there was a 2-seater outhouse on that property, and I know about where it was. I walked up there not too long ago with Terry Bopes.
Yes, oh, okay, Terry mentioned that he's been.
Who I think is on your committee.
Yeah.
And there's also a depression as you go north of that site, which I had originally thought was an old granary log.
Yeah.
But that's much too wet.
Yeah, and there's no evidence anywhere in Plymouth Colony that the Pilgrims built in depressions. They built near water on a hill, for observation, for, certainly for climate. Well, I'd love to chat with you more. Terry has told me about your conversations. Are you in Wadsworth?
Yes.
Yeah.